Do you ever think about the inequities we see all around us? What if I told you they aren't just accidents or things that just happened? What if they were the result of intentional design? It's a really powerful idea because if something was designed, well, that means we can redesign it.
This right here is the whole idea behind a framework called equity by design. It's a bold statement, for sure, but it completely reframes how we look at the problem. It shifts us from just being observers of a broken system to being active architects of a brand new one.
I know. That's a huge question, isn't it? It almost sounds like a conspiracy theory. But the history, well, the history is actually pretty clear. And to understand how we can redesign our systems for equity, especially in places like our schools, we absolutely have to understand the original blueprint of the problem.
To really get it, we've got to go back in time. See, the ideas that prop up racism weren't just random feelings or prejudices. They were deliberately built, often with the shiny veneer of science, to make them seem legitimate.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in the late 1800s, right after the Civil War. This was a massive turning point. You have 4 million people who went from being legally defined as property to being citizens. And America's white intellectual elite had to figure out what that was going to mean. The ideas they came up with would echo for a century, and honestly, we're still feeling them today. Let's talk about this guy, Nathaniel Shaler. Now, he wasn't some nobody on the fringe. He was a respected scientist at Harvard. And by framing the very existence of black people in America as a problem, he and a lot of others created a story that needed a solution. And that so-called solution, more often than not, was all about control, segregation, and oppression. Okay, listen really closely to how Shaler words this. He's admitting that slavery was a mistake, sure, but notice who the victim is in his story. It's the white men of his time who inherited this predicament. The focus completely shifts away from the horrifying injustice done to black people and onto the problem their freedom supposedly created for white society. It's a masterclass in flipping the narrative. And look, this wasn't just talk. A whole intellectual industry popped up to back this worldview. You had people like Samuel George Morton using human skulls to try and prove a racial hierarchy. You had social Darwinism getting twisted to say, hey, inequality is just nature's way. This work basically gave moral permission for everything that came next. You can draw a straight line from these ideas to school policies like academic tracking and the biases baked into the earliest standardized tests. They were all built on this faulty foundation.
All right, let's fast forward to today. We've got all these modern problem-solving tools, right? Like design thinking, it's super popular in tech, in business, and especially in education. But what happens when you take a tool like that and try to fix a problem that was designed with this deep historical inequity at its core?
Now, on the surface, design thinking is amazing. I mean, who doesn't love empathy, focusing on the user, and innovation? But here's the catch. If you don't actively look for and account for things like power, privilege, and your own biases, the whole process can become colorblind. And when that happens, you end up creating solutions that, at best, don't actually help the people who need it most, and at worst, well, they can actually make the old unfair system even stronger. This quote just nails it, doesn't it? If your problem-solving process ignores the reality of race and systemic inequality, then your solutions will too. It's simple, really. You can't fix a problem you refuse to see.
So, if our standard approach has this huge blind spot, what do? Well, you need a new approach, one that builds equity in from the very beginning. And that is what equity by design is all about.
Equity by design is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You take the creative problem-solving engine of design thinking and you fuse it with the critical self-awareness of racial equity work. The goal is to be just as intentional, just as deliberate about creating equity as those original designers were about creating inequity.
And it's built on 3 core beliefs. First, you have to see our history. That means connecting the dots from people like Nathaniel Shaler all the way to the school policies we have today. Second, you have to make the invisible visible. That's about calling out our own biases and the unspoken power dynamics in a room. And third, and this is so important, you have to design at the margins. Instead of designing for the average person, you start with and design with the people who are most left out by the way things are now.
Okay, that all sounds great in theory, but how do we actually do it? Especially for those of us who are educators, teachers, principals, where do you even begin? This is probably the toughest part, but it's also the most critical. Before we try to redesign a school policy or a classroom culture, the Equity by Design framework asks us to look in the mirror. It all starts with a really honest, courageous look at our own beliefs, our own biases, and our own experiences. So, the framework has us start with this question.
Now, edges here means the limits of your own perspective. What ideas about success or intelligence or even good behavior did you just sort of absorb from your family, your own schooling, your culture? How might those inherited ideas be shaping the way you see your students right now?
Then, the next question takes it a step further. Where are you being challenged? A bleeding edge is that place of discomfort. Maybe it's that tension you feel when a conversation about race gets real, or that little voice in your head that says your curriculum just isn't reaching some of your students. The idea is to lean into that discomfort, because that's exactly where the growth happens. And finally, how do you take all this internal work and bring it out into the open? This isn't about making some big announcement. It's about being vulnerable. It might look like a school principal saying, "You know what, I don't have all the answers here," in a staff meeting. Or a teacher trying a new approach, and then openly sharing with colleagues what worked and what totally bombed.
See, when we start asking ourselves these tough questions, we develop a new kind of vision. We start to see the invisible. We can suddenly recognize how a school's zero-tolerance policy is basically a modern version of those 19th century ideas about control, or how a supposedly colorblind way of hiring teachers might be accidentally filtering out incredible candidates of color.
And this reminds us that this work is not passive. It's not a checklist. It requires a plan that is smarter, more creative, and way more intentional than the old systems it's trying to replace. It's about actively building bridges to counteract those historical designs of separation.
And that brings us right back to the beginning. This isn't just something to think about. The whole point of equity by design is that we all have power. We are all designers in our own lives and in our own work. So the real question isn't just if we can redesign our world. It's what piece of it are you going to redesign first? A lesson plan, a team meeting, a school-wide policy? The drawing board is yours.